passage from the end of the book that kind of uses a lot of the frameworks that are already discussed during the book to talk about kind of the very fetishized place of writers in American society. I was kind of, I was directly inspired by an article that Jennifer Egan, who's amazing and I love, published in Time magazine. That was kind of a bad article where she kind of makes the argument that like now writers are more important than ever because Trump is this terrible autocratic threat and writers are of course the answer. So I'm going to read kind of with that general thing in mind. Honestly, the institutional isolation of American writers shouldn't be a surprise in a country where small talk with strangers begins with, "So what do you do?" A question that means, what are you for and how does your function relate to mine? Where are you, we want to know, within capitalism? Where can I find you on its map? In this context, writer or author is often insufficient and we are more specifically labeled poet, novelist, journalist, memoirist, theorist, essayist, academic, playwright, or whatever it was we borrowed all that debt to study or simulate. Obviously, there are many poets who write novels, many novelists who write essays, and so on, but there is a pattern and one to criticize, particularly in the schism between creative and academic writers, or the difference that fine can make in whatever arts you're certified master of. Overall, any carefully cultivated specialization is isolating and purposefully so, not only a necessary precursor to fascism, but an organizing tenet of capitalism. Craft in writing, or the focus on sentences, the way they sound, making them pretty and making them work. Craft in writing is capital at work. Here's where that so-called literary genre comes from, novels full of barking dogs, dying professors, or dying parents, horny professors, the kind of thing Lukács called a caricature of the novel, bound to nothing and based on nothing. The CV novel out of the way so that one can teach others about the tools of writing. This isolation, the split between creative and academic on a cultural scale, is contemporaneous with the gradual disappearance of criticism from the public sphere, measured against, say, the 60s or 70s. During the Reagan years, writers seem to have publicly turned away from what were traditionally writers' concerns: politics, the relationship between art and the public imagination, the role of storytelling on a national scale, and so on. Writers, in short, with plenty of help from insidious, well-financed, expertly aimed conservative propaganda, think of Hollywood movies for one, have grown cynical about literary citizenship. Our careers are most successful when we are encouraged to write our lyrical novels or self-reflective poems or personal essays, but to write exactingly about art or literature as opposed to appraising visual or literary products for consumption is unmarketable. Some editors admit this openly. As Hal Foster writes in Bad New Days, the relative irrelevance of criticism is evident enough in an art world where value is determined by market position above all. But criticism, Foster adds, is not merely a crucial part of the public sphere. In some ways, criticism is this sphere in operation. Critical writing is dialectical. By revering literature and holding individual works accountable to aesthetic, ethical, and political standards, it pulls the form and the culture with it forward and open. Otherwise, novels and other artworks simply appear. Without a multitude of accessible platforms for intelligent feedback, the books one reads and the movies one sees become just another part of an individual's matrix of choices or tastes. More commodities, more images to consume as part of one's lifestyle. People often get very defensive about this, hence the meme, just let people enjoy things. And one can't produce, market, or distribute commodities in this country without participating in its profit-driven race to the bottom, of cost, of quality, of reputation, and of value. Confining literature to aesthetic concerns, to craft, has been this country's extraordinarily successful and multi-decade degradation of literature's relevance as a public art form. You know the Adorno quote, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric." Often misread as an indictment, Adorno's concern is not methods of expression so much as the will toward compartmentalization that made Auschwitz possible. To pursue and create beauty after the revelations of the Holocaust is barbaric, but that doesn't mean one can't do it. It means that barbarism, usually a filter meant to hide whatever we don't like about humanity, outside of its frame, is inseparable from our own culture. Barbarism is the repulsive part of our adaptability. To be happy or to pursue happiness among so much suffering is to become complicit in the creation and perpetuation of that suffering. This is what it means when we go on shopping, go on meeting for brunch, go on buying plane tickets, despite the bleaching of reefs worldwide, the rising of the oceans, and the annual burning of landscapes almost incomprehensibly vast. The only real end of this complicity is death, which calls to mind so many of Auschwitz survivors, including Primo Levi, Paul Celan, and Jean Emery, who died by suicide decades after they escaped. It evokes Virginia Woolf, who never saw the war's end, or Stefan Zweig, for whom the world became too terrible in 1942. Walter Benjamin, arrested on his way to America in 1940, gave himself a fatal dose of morphine. Fascism trades in death. Its currency is death, hence its attraction to aesthetics, to the imposition of images upon others. So fixed in our places, we are imagined as dead before dying. Our deaths make sense. You often see this with, gay men or black civil rights leaders. As concerns the United States of America in the 21st century, here is where Sarah Schulman's distinction between conflict and abuse becomes the greatest societal urgency in human history. I'm getting a cramp in my hand. The Republican Party of the United States, championing Islamophobia, denying and exacerbating climate change, stripping trans and non-binary persons of their rights, supporting police brutality against the black community, destroying indigenous access to ancestral land, incarcerating immigrants and separating children from their families, downplaying or subverting information about a global pandemic that has led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans, in short, committing crime upon crime against humanity, all of which is not only visible but meant to be visible, is a global terrorist organization. It sinks its roots not only in white and Christian supremacy, but the supremacy of wealth. Its hate is intersectional and must be dismantled intersectionally, not only in identity politics, but in class warfare, or simply in the aggressive insistence that human beings across the planet have the unilateral, unquestioned right not to drown or burn or starve. To tolerate everything, or anything, that the Republican Party stands for or to excuse it as just politics, is to tolerate genocide. We live in a misogynistic, racist, homo and transphobic, ableist, violent, and viciously unequal country whose relatively small population, 4.4% of the world, and vast wealth, 25%, leave us, individual voters and protesters, responsible for the fate and future of this planet as its oceans rise and reefs die, as its air grows increasingly contaminated and water less potable. To feel so powerless and yet accountable for the future of the human race means that the sheer number of traumatized persons living in America is staggering. We are rooted in a country created by two concurrent genocides and supported by 2 centuries of wars, spectacular terrorism, theft, and global oppression. What's worse, as Schulman argues, traumatized persons, through their actions, amplify and spread trauma to others by shunning, bullying, silencing, scapegoating, and threatening. They cling to what little they're given as payment for their complicity in worldwide destruction at the profit of the small minority of white, wealthy men. This is why we have been trained to treat one another, to consume one another as images. We are learning to discard and be discarded. Dictators understand very well, Jennifer Egan writes, that the strength of thought and analysis that literature embodies is a threat to the mind control that is an essential feature of tyranny. She's right, of course, but she may as well be describing the last several decades of American economic conditions, which are an isolating, mind-controlling tyranny of their own. Curiously, it's only because of this president that Egan's article exists, a phenomenon familiar to many magazines and newspapers. This autocratic spectacle provides a wellspring of oppositional content, all framed as necessary under tyranny or as resistance you can buy. But this is mere reaction, a marketing opportunity. Any media organization that seeks to widen its profits in the shadow of fascism will soon find fascism a desirable shadow in which to widen its profits. And any writer who stakes their value on this kind of resistance shrivels into a pundit. Meanwhile, ceding to writers a vague and priestly importance in place of criticism, we get what Foster calls fetishistic discourse. By imbuing the creative author, for example, with a fetishistic degree of authority or authenticity, publishing as an industry leaves little or no authority to the critical author. This reverence is another flank of cynicism, a turning away from literature's anchor in our daily lives, and the renunciation of literary citizenship. By literary citizenship, I mean having a socio-political awareness of literature, not volunteering to read manuscripts in a magazine. And why shouldn't citizenship be a key or even radical issue for writers, as it is for everyone else? After all, no conscious person in the 21st century America has the right to be shocked at how totalitarian capitalism destroys the individual capacity for citizenship. Do you, as an American, have time to participate in your democracy? Or is that time indebted to some other task? As a reader, do you have time to practice enriching your reading with poetry, even if you prefer biographies? If you are a writer, do you have time to give you a new kind of project when your publisher isn't likely to recognize as part of your skill set? From the perspective of citizenship, it is radical to resist not only the commodification of art, but the commodification of oneself. It's here where criticism offers a very different form of resistance, an anti-cynicism, a turning toward or a meeting of the gaze. There is no universal truth, but via aesthetic, political, and ethical criticism, there is dialectical truth. In the rushing flow of commodities, a dialectical approach to the art we make and the relationships we forge can be the rock in the river, the stick in the spokes. Interrogating failures alongside pleasures, criticism resists reducing our works and ourselves to consumable images. It fosters a sensibility of plural validation. A book is this and that, an author's vision successful, challenging, and problematic. It recognizes works and persons as existing in time and capable of change, the concept upon which all radical hopes are built.
Okay, well, it's exciting to be here. Thanks for that passage. And I am going to start out here with a brief confession, which is that...
You haven't read the book?
I have read the book. My confession is that as I was preparing for this event and reading the book, sometime back, I thought, is it possible that Patrick is too smart?
No.
And I thought...
I'm profoundly stupid.
I thought, should I back out and flee this event? Because one of the joys of this book, one of the things that's, I think, you succeed at very well is something very difficult, which is following the flow of your intellectation throughout the book. I think you do a really wonderful job in this book of making thinking, like allowing us to follow a train of thought on the page. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do in a book. It's also terrifying for an interlocutor when they think, I might not be smart enough to talk about this book with Patrick. But you know what? I faced my fears.
I'm very proud of you. I thank you. That really means a lot to me because thank you.
Well, it's a wickedly smart book, and I think that kind of leads into my first question for you, which is that this book is packed with ideas. It is hungry to engage with the world in all its minute forms. And I'm just curious, and I don't know if there's a way to answer this question, but I'm curious as how did you go about wrangling all the ideas into a cohesive form? How does one go about, synthesizing this much material into a comprehensible thing?
Well, of course, it was awful. No, so I had been. I talk about this in the book how the book actually the whole thing started. I was on Twitter, and I had just started working on a new essay that I kind of hit that point where I was like, all right, I've written enough, now I can go do something stupid. And I went online, and this was back in the age when people used memes a little bit more sincerely. And I made like a little thing about like finally working on an essay again, and I took a GIF from Kill Bill that was about her like trying to resuscitate her atrophied limbs. And it got me like really interested in photography and how images work and how they're used as language, and then this whole circus from hell started happening in 2015 and 2016, and I kind of realized that these are very much related, and I started just pulling in more and more reading, more and more text, more and more kind of ideas, and I think it was like connecting, even if it was totally arbitrary, connecting the kind of idea of like computer images, GIFs as being in motion, to something that Hannah Arendt says in The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is that a fundamental aspect of a totalitarian regime is that it must stay in motion, which then got me thinking about the way that the media can never hold anything for more than about 24 hours and before they need something else. And I kind of, the hardest part of all of that was deciding what order it would go in. And the way that, I mean, if I had any shape to do like whatever I wanted with, I would have written a book that was like the spokes of a wheel, you know, because everything kind of comes from a central place, but goes out in separate directions.
Yeah.
And it was really hard not to do all that without feeling like I was just repeating myself. And that's actually part of why the book is laid out the way it is. I don't know if anybody's seen it or not, but it has not only little text boxes that kind of interpolate within the book, but it also has page references in the margins. Because I do that when I read books. I like write like a note that's like, see page 262, where the author says something similar. And so I just decided, well, it's my book, I'll just do it myself and publish it that way. And it kind of helped get rid of the temptation to be like, earlier we spoke about, and it was just easier to do it that way.
Yeah. Does your brain work in a kind of like very rational, logical, outliney kind of form, or do you get onto something and kind of like follow the heat of it and then impose some structure later?
Yes.
Yeah, both.
Sort of. I think I had a visual of kind of the emotional and I don't know, I guess hectoring tone that it would take, where it would start off urgent and serious and kind of go into this like, aren't we having fun playing with language, and then return back to the urgent and serious. And some of that was outlining, and some of that was just the general like feeling that I wanted the book to give. Yeah.
Following where it led.
Yeah. I think, and then, I do that with novels too. I think it's there's a Nabokov quote where he says, "The pattern of the thing precedes the thing." I tend to come up with a structure before I'm able to do anything, which doesn't work for like if I'm writing just something for a magazine. Doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
I have no idea what the hell that's going to look like, and it never turns out how I think it's going to.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned fiction writing, and I had read your novel, Some Hell, a couple years back, and it's a wonderful novel. And then when you released this
Can
book...
you do that as a blurb, like the next edition?
Absolutely.
It's a very novel.
This book could not be more different from your last book in many ways.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
It's fascinating to me, just both from like publishing industry kind of stuff, where you put out a first book that's a novel, and then you're a novelist, and the industry expects either you've got your dreaded sophomore novel coming up, or maybe the dreaded sophomore novel isn't quite right, so you've got your short story collection that are mostly done in your MFA program, and you polish those up. But this isn't either of those things. This is something totally different.
Yeah.
What was that? Why the swerve? How did that all?
Urgency, kind of a compulsion, I guess. I did write another novel after, actually it was before Somehow even came out. It was, Grey Wolf offered to buy it in 2015 and didn't publish it until 2018, so there's like a long period where they were like kind of working through their schedule, and I was like, I need to do something. So I wrote another novel, and they didn't take it. Retroactively, I understand, because it's a giant mess. It's 460 pages, total disaster. But then I started writing a lot of essays about, photography and stuff, and I was like, what if this is a book? And I've heard that nonfiction is so much easier, which is totally not true. And so then I got it into my head that I would do a book. And the initial proposal that we put together was totally another mess that didn't work out. And then I went back and thought about it for a while and worked on it with my agent, and finally that's what happened.
So there's, with this switch to nonfiction, there's an issue you address kind of early in the book about expertise and about kind of the question of having the right to tackle these subjects. I mean, by your training, you're not trained in photography or fascism or political science stuff. You use a very interesting phrase early in the book about the trap of none of my business.
Yeah.
And I'm curious.
No, I think a lot of people kind of fall into that, where they're, well, I don't know about this stuff. Or, this is not something that I should be writing. Somebody else should write it. But it was important to me, and so I wrote it. And I'm also professionally insecure, very insecure. I don't have an MFA. I don't have any kind of training. I didn't even read every book for a class in college until my final semester, and I was like, I'm paying to be here? I should probably show up and read the books. So I was a huge slacker and didn't really take anything seriously. But it was actually, and this is, if the book has any kind of godmother, it's definitely Susan Sontag. Mm-hmm. And reading her journals right around 2015, when I started to kind of initially think about these things, they were filled with so much intense energy and the will to seek out and learn. Mm-hmm. And it kind of made me think of well, what's wrong with that? Yeah. If you want to know something, why shouldn't you just go read a bunch of books about it and think about it for a while?
Yeah. And I don't know a ton about her, but I don't think she didn't have a PhD.
Yeah, she did.
Oh, she did? Okay.
Well, so sure. It's complicated. So when she was, no, I mean, she went to college when she was 16. Then she went to Oxford right after that, or something. I don't know. I think she dropped out of her PhD program, but then was awarded one later or something like that. But okay. she was professionally trained in religious studies and philosophy, and she went to the Chicago school when it was still very much based in the super hardcore Western curriculum, where all the students had to read Plato, all the students had to all that. So she was definitely ahead of me in that in that way. But I think it was much more about just the will to go out and educate yourself.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that insecurity, as you describe it, seems like a powerful engine. I mean, that like
Yeah.
a valuable engine.
Well, and I
to
think
one's work.
it's very no shade, but it's very much a Midwestern thing too. You know, I don't live in New York. I don't live,
Yeah.
you know, have this attitude like I'm just like a schlub from the provinces. So like I gotta pretend I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. It's valuable. It's valuable.
It is.
So I wanted to ask a few questions kind of about fascism more broadly, because that's, you know, so much of the book is about that. And
Why, is there anything going on in the news?
no, nothing. So I don't know if it's valuable to, I mean, there's the like, I think kind of a lot of people think of the fascism and the like Wikipedia, Mussolini, and some of the stuff you're talking about, this book is a bit broader. It's certainly related and, you know, in that same framework. I was intrigued by some of the ideas you were addressing with fascism and isolation, and like how those two things encounter each other. Like, what's value? How does fascism isolate people? What does it gain from isolation? How? I'm curious what you want to say about that.
So I think there's actually something really interesting about this that did just happen in the news. I'm sure most people are aware that Italy just elected a fascist prime minister. And she gave a speech shortly after, maybe the same night, that kind of made the rounds. And it's full of, you know, anti-Semitic dog whistles and all kinds of misogynistic and homophobic language about like the family, and you know. But she says something, and this is the really dangerous, seductive aspect of fascism, is that she says we have, basically it boils down to, we have the right to be more than we have the right to be more than consumers. And you know, and this is part of her super anti-Semitic trope of like who's controlling global finances and all this shit. But if you think about it, this is largely what neoliberal governance has offered people, is that you can be anything, you can be free as long as you buy. That's the only thing that matters. And I think there's something spiritually catastrophic about that. And I think that is a large part of the reason that Donald Trump found so much success in terms of getting people not just to follow his racist agenda and you know all that, but getting people passionate. And that's, I think, where fascism sets itself apart. Who the hell is passionate about neoliberal governance? Who the hell is passionate about the Democratic Party? You know, people are passionate about democratic socialism. People are passionate about, you know. But there's something there's a need that's not being met. And it comes largely from this idea of being so isolated in thinking of yourself as confined to a matrix of identities, which is, you know, very much encouraged by a consumer culture. You know, if you're this kind of identity, we're going to market to you in this way. You're going to be interested in these products. You're going to watch these shows. You're going to be in these little social media bubbles. You know, I think I hate this so much, but I think you know, the overwhelming homogeneity that happened across gay bars after RuPaul's Drag Race attained so much prominence is that you know, boom, it just hit like the right consumer market, and suddenly everybody's kind of speaking the same, interested in the same things. Not everybody, but you know what I mean. It's easy to fall into that trap, and I think it's really easy then to become to feel like there's something missing, to feel like you're not really yourself. Fascism is reacting to this isolation. It offers a easy, quick, and spectacular answer to a very difficult problem. And the mainstream governments aren't interested in offering another one.
Yeah. And when you talk about this, easy, it's simplistic. There's a quote, I had marked this. You write, "Fascism's deepest appeal is a schism from reality. It not only bristles against the contradictions of a complex society, but actively erases them, installing fictions in their place." And there's a lot in the book where you kind of talk about fascism's goal is kind of to like erase complexity, is to produce homogeneity. Mm-hmm. So there's a way in which it feels like you're arguing about, complexity and queerness as acts of resistance against fascism, against the flattening of the sameness of everything.
Right.
Does that? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, this is why so many conservatives can't bear the existence of trans people. It's too hard to understand, and the world should just be like this or that. There should be one or the other. It's so much simpler to understand, and it doesn't affect them, but there's this idea that I think another really fun thing to talk about in that way is what everybody calls human nature. It's human nature to be selfish. It's human nature to want to hurt others, when it's not. There have been studies upon studies upon studies and books upon books upon books about how these are not innate, instinctive attitudes. They're learned. And anybody who's going around mumbling about human nature is just looking for an excuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know how much more time I want to take here. I'm curious. So a lot of this book also is about social media and images, and I'm curious how that plays out in your own life.
Poorly.
I know you as someone who has been on Twitter, has quit Twitter, as it's obviously for all of us it's a complicated thing. So I'm curious as how that manifests in your own life, how you try to negotiate around this thing that's both ever present and totally unimportant and inescapably important.
I think of it as an addiction, honestly. I stay away from it. I feel good. I get tempted. I binge. I feel like shit. I leave. Come back. Yeah. It's really difficult because, again, I feel there's this weird tacit understanding, if you want your career to be more successful, you should be visible on social media so people know what you're doing and what you're saying and where you're going. Who found this event via Twitter? Anybody? Oh, one person. Okay. Shouldn't have raised your hand. But I have also met tons of people. I met my agent on Twitter. I've gotten things published because of people who've reached out on Twitter. I mean, it's, and so here's the difficulty. It's not bad or destructive to have the ability to interact with other people online, even in 280 characters at a time. It's not destructive to have instantaneous connection with other people all over the world. The thing that troubles me about social media is its structure. And by that is usually who owns it, who programs it, and for what purpose. And as you know, we all know over the last 10 years, hearing about Facebook and Instagram and now Twitter and TikTok being kind of all of those put together and blended with a little plutonium. The form itself is fascist. It thrives on reducing the most complex ideas into simple, easily digested, and easily passed on factoids, meaning not true. Things that resemble facts but are not facts. And because of that structure, anybody who uses those platforms, no matter how ethically resolute you are, no matter how progressive your politics, the platform is doing its best to subvert what you are saying, to subvert what you are doing. I have seen so many users of social media basically be undone by it in terms of having like a meteoric rise of success based on their very progressive politics, become unimaginable bullies and start to like basically shift toward punching down on others. And the things that you say that actually get traction on social media are the things that probably are better left unsaid. And I think it is worth keeping that in mind when you use these platforms, because the temptation to want to go viral, to want to be heard, will start to alter your language, and it will start to alter what you say. I have the most fun on those platforms when I'm a shit poster. You know, I don't say anything serious, and I just have fun. And then, of course, someone makes me mad, and I start to think, like, oh, maybe I should say something sincere, and then I regret it. It's like, it's so difficult to be sincere on those platforms. You know? It should just be for, like, pictures of dogs, pictures of butts, and pictures of food, you know, and that's it.
That's the Holy Trinity
That's
right
that. That's all it.
All right, well, maybe we should open things up to the crowd. At some point, I don't want to like derail things. At some point, I would love to hear about your next book too. But maybe we stay on the same topic of this book for the moment, and as we close out, you could give us a tiny little snippet about what that all is.
Sure. Questions?
And can you, Will, repeat the question?
Oh,
if you
sure,
have one?
yeah.
In terms of the fascist hegemony / conservatives' fear / misunderstanding of trans people, also in consideration with the necessity of fascism to remain mobile, would you consider through essentially the first section of your book that fascism is rather reiterating, or its only goal is to maintain its own definition of mobile, in terms of trans people rather than being complex, simply breaking all of the metaphysical borders of image?
I don't know if I'm going to do a good job of rephrasing this, but Corva's question was about fascism's kind of fear and antagonism to transness and its need for mobility its necessity for mobility and
Well, okay, I'll try to enunciate. Rather than fascism's singular goal of remaining mobile, would you consider it rather its only goal to be its reiteration of its own definition of mobility? Because trans people end up breaking essentially the borders of image.
Is it breaking its own, or is it trying to reiterate its own definition of mobility? I don't think it has a definition. I don't think it considers itself mobile. I think that's part of its appeal, is that it broadcasts itself as eternal. One of the fascists that I talk about in the book is Camille Paglia, who was very big in the early 90s and was very much all about psychoanalytically based approaches to art in terms of, art is Apollonian and Dionysian because it's either male or female, and, the male art is afraid of the big womanly vagina that's dark and mysterious, and she's an interesting person. But I think part of like her whole appeal was that she was saying that, she was also a big proponent of women who dress the way they do should get raped because they're basically asking for it. I mean, she was publishing op-eds in the New York Times about women who dress like this shouldn't complain when they get attacked because they're giving into this like role of being a woman. And she was very much framing this kind of stuff as, these are the eternal rules. This is how it's always been because this is, what life is on this planet. And I don't think, while it does change its tactics constantly and it changes its targets constantly, I don't think it thinks itself as changing those things. I take the thought experiment of fascists being okay with gays and lesbians right now, but trans and non-binary people, they're pushing it too far. Well, what happens when they get rid of the trans and binary people? Suddenly there's going to be, we didn't really mean that about gays and lesbians. I mean, they're obviously a problem too. I mean, the whole goal is to get rid of everybody who doesn't conform 100%. I don't think it thinks of itself as being mobile or even reactive. I don't think it thinks of itself as being reactive. I think it thinks of itself as being oppressed. I mean, that's the real dangerous thing about it, is that the people who subscribe to this and broadcast it either sincerely or insincerely see themselves as victims and to talk about themselves as victims. It's gross.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was gonna say one thing that I found while I was reading the book is I would get to
If you want, I can just hand the mic
Oh,
over.
sure. Cool. I was just gonna say that while I was reading the book, there are points where I would get to I don't know, a sentence that felt like it was a really good point. I was like, oh, that's a good point. And then I would try to read it. They'd be like, wait, that sentence makes no sense without this one. I have to go back. And it's like, oh, that's a whole page. So since so much of what the book seems to be about is how robbing things of their context shallows them, when you were writing this, were you deliberately thinking on the sentence level of trying to avoid making this something that could be taken out of context?
No, not deliberately at all. And in fact, I was really mad at myself when it turned out to be that way. I mean, it makes sense, and I thank you for pointing that out because that's a very nice way to put it. But I was trying to promote the book on social media, and turns out it's really hard to promote a book that you can't excerpt. You can't even take a picture of a paragraph too easily. You can't sum up in a little elevator pitch. I think on the one hand, that would be, that would have been really great to like have that, but on the other, I think in a perfect world where the publishing industry just doesn't exist, yeah, I think that does very much serve the book and the project. Basically, be like, if you want the story, here's the whole thing. It is kind of as stuffed and overblown and even kind of campy as it is. It also feels like it's just enough. I don't know.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I was just gonna say, how much of what was in the book, I know you kind of talked about how you came up with ideas kind of briefly. How much of, I guess, the literature or stuff that was discussed within the book were things kind of you were already reading already and you wanted a place to kind of go with these ideas versus this is the idea for the book, so I'm going to go and pursue
Yeah,
these texts?
no, that's actually a really good question. By the time that I knew what I was writing, I did very little homework. There were a few books that I sought out after I kind of wanted to fill in some gaps, but for the most part, most of the things that I reached for while I was writing, I literally reached for, because they were like on my shelf, and I was like, oh yeah, isn't there that passage in Heidegger where he, and that's why I think part of why the book seems so all over the place in terms of its influences. It's not because like I got the idea for the book and I was like, all right, it's time to read everything. It was more like, here's what I've read and here's what I can talk about, and if I need to, I'm going to reach for those things that I've read as kind of, I guess, little things to hop on, if that makes any sense.
I'd like to know about your writing process.
All right, questions about
Writing
Patrick's writing process?
It's it's very different for every book. Well, is that true? Maybe. Yeah, I think, because like the first book, I did very much the like cliche writing advice kind of thing. Like, I showed up every day and I put my butt in the chair and I wrote what I needed to write, and I didn't really worry too much about what I was writing. And turns out for me that's a way to make sure I do it 11 times. And for this book, I was lucky in that I was kind of obsessed with these things before I realized it was going to be a book. And I published, I think, about 11 essays that I ended up... This is actually a fun process question. I don't think I've talked about this before. I printed out everything that I had published and cut every paragraph out and basically like kind of rearranged them and stapled paragraphs like together in the order that I thought would make the book flow a little bit more as a whole. And then I kind of slapped it down on my desk and retyped it to make it. It basically like I stitched together the monster and then like buffed the stitches out in a way. And that, to go back to your question that I ignored, that's like kind of was my way of, I guess, deciding how to sequence the book. And Yeah. And then at some point I realized, like, all the paragraphs that didn't fit, I'm going to squeeze them in anyway in these little boxes in the, yeah, so.
No, I also mean, like, process. Like, what was your sleeping schedule?
Oh. So this one, so my first book, I got up at 5 in the morning, made coffee, sat down, wrote for an hour, and went to work. It was very much a kind of a regular activity. Actually, the first draft, I also, my husband was watching Lost at the time. It was like a regular thing that he was doing with friends. And I had no interest in the show. So I would like literally go over to the house where everybody was watching this program. Who saw it? Like, okay. So, and I would put on headphones and I would write. And I always knew that the writing time was up because every single episode of Lost was a cliffhanger. And when it was over, everybody would go like, "Oh, God damn it!" And that would be like my signal. Oh, the writing's done. Because I would hear everybody kind of like scream. So I'd spent a lot of time doing that. Anyway, this one, I actually quit my job shortly after, well, not shortly after, a while after selling my first book. And it wasn't anything, it wasn't like I was rolling in it or anything. It was more like, I can't do this job anymore, and I'm going to try freelancing. And so I was alone for most of the day. I would get up, make coffee, make breakfast, send him on his way, and mostly not write. I ended up going to a lot of coffee shops and eating a lot of croissants. But eventually would write for the majority of the morning, and then in the afternoon I would do more reading, or I would have, copywriting or copy editing or something that I had to get done. But I would always do the creative stuff first.
So the majority of the morning, you mean like what, 3-4 hours?
2.
Okay.
I think like 2 solid hours of writing nonfiction is solid. That's good. After that, I start to kind of sound hysteric. Like my pitch just goes like out of control, and I feel like, yeah. And then that part of my brain just kind of goes dark, and I do like copy editing or copywriting or something like that. Yeah, good stuff.
Right.
All right. Should we sign some books?
Yeah.
Let's go.
All right.
Sweet.
So,
Oh,
yeah.
wait, yes.
So the books that are up there, they're all books that are mentioned in the book, and they're all really good. So if you're at all intrigued by any of them, you should get them. If you need recommendations, we can talk about it. And the new book is a novel set in 1950s Hollywood about a closeted Hungarian immigrant who befriends a very famous actress, and turns out that there's more to her than would seem, and very much about art and art history as well. And I don't know, it was such a relief to write something that's totally not real after this project.
Yeah.
It was a nice break. So,
Yeah.
and that'll come out in 2024.
Cool.
So
I saw a little blurb description of it somewhere, and it sounded really cool. So
that's for the that's for the film
we'll,
agents.
we'll get the audience
Fingers
excited
crossed.
about that.
All
Yeah.
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.